Sefer Bamidbar, Parshat Shelach, on redeeming captives. In this week's Parsha, the Holy Land is in reach. We learn a few more mitzvot, including those about taking of challah and the wearing of tzitzit, both so fundamental to practical pieces of Jewish observance to this day. But the focus of the Parsha is on the incident with the 12 meraglim, often translated as spies. Moshe sends a respected man from each of the 12 tribes into the land. What an incredible moment. They spend 40 days exploring the land of Israel, seeing how plentiful it is and how much abundance that it creates, famously bringing back souvenirs, including a cluster of grapes so heavy that it needed to be carried on poles by 2 men. But when they give their report of this glorious place, things turn sour. The majority of the men express fear, absolute terror at the thought of trying to enter this land of giant fruit and giant people to settle it. They are filled and in turn fill their tribes with dismay. Caleb and Joshua dissent, reminding the people that God has commanded their possession of the land and will surely fight with them to secure it. This is when God sentences the people to wander for 40 years in the wilderness until just their children remain. And then those younger generations will enter the land. One thing that might seem interesting or even strange to modern people, though traditionally observant Jews still acknowledge such scenarios in our daily prayers, even when they feel distant from our personal lives, is the fear of kidnapping. In the 3rd verse of chapter 14, the people ask if it wouldn't be better for them to return to Egypt. After all, they suggest, going into a land like this guarantees that the men will be killed and their wives and children will be taken as spoils. What's the cost of a loved one being taken captive? How much can we pay to redeem her? What is a human life worth? These are questions that rightly turn our stomachs. While actuaries calculate insurance policies based on projected lifetime earning potential, risk behaviors, and other factors, while we have historic price sheets for humans sold as slaves, the modern religious response to the value of a human life, a life created in the likeness of the divine, is so clearly and inarguably priceless. But we do not live in the ideal world. Historically, taking captives has been, however, regrettably, quite a normal practice, both in terms of hostages taken for ransom and those kidnapped for direct coercion, including all the various types of slavery. This fear was real, and it's understandable. Aside from the psychological torment of knowing that your wife or child is in the hands of an enemy, the seemingly insurmountable challenge of hopefully getting them back safely, alive, in the historical context of the Tanakh, this was a human resource issue. Taking women and children captive cut off the continuity of a people that was just forming. Jewish men could not have continued the Jewish nation on their own. And in captivity, we assume that all people, women, children, as well as grown men, will not be permitted to carry on the ways of being Jewish. They will be forced to relinquish any semblance of a cultural identity, either assimilating with the culture of their captors or taking on the role of an underclass whose peoplehood is formed as a response to that of their oppressors. To this day, the transfer of children from one nation or people to another is viewed as a tool contributing to genocide. When the men of Israel worried about their families being taken captive, they were not distressed simply about possible harm done to individuals, but reinforcing that with odds like they were hearing, the project of Jewish peoplehood was doomed to fail. Jewish history is full of examples, large and small, of our people being taken and held captive, as well as persistent attempts at fulfilling the mitzvah of Pidyon Shavuyim, the redemption of captives. There's a certain view where the redemption of captives is a black and white Jewish value. The Babylonian Talmud in Bava Batra refers to it as a mitzvah rabbah, a great commandment, going on to describe being held captive as worse than being killed or starved. The assumption is that in captivity, you are subjected to at least fear of all these things, if not the reality. The Rambam says in his Hilchot Matznot Aniyim, his elucidation of the laws related to gifts we make to the poor, that there's no greater mitzvah than Pidyon Shvuyim. While we see in our lives many people who need and are deserving of help, in the case of a captive, we must assume that he is also hungry, unclothed, and at risk for unjust treatment, up to and including death. Captives suffer from a poverty of concern from others, a poverty of our attention in ways that others in need do not. To ignore the duty of redeeming captives is to violate several commandments pertaining not just to captivity directly, but broader social requirements we have about ensuring the welfare and safety of all members of our community. Rambam goes so far as to declare that if a community has purchased the building materials for a synagogue, all cut to size and ready to be assembled, every last bit of it should be sold off if necessary to raise the ransom for a captive. The Shulchan Aruch builds on this line of thought in Yoredeya, stating that every single moment, that the ransom of a captive is unnecessarily delayed. This is as though those causing the delay were actively shedding his blood. But soon after, the Shulchan Aruch echoes a principle we find as early as the Mishnah in Tractate Gittin, that there should be a limit to how much we will pay to ransom a captive, lest we put a price on our own heads in the minds of others. Famously, the Maharam of Württemberg was taken and held as a captive for years. He forbade his own redemption on the basis that we shouldn't create a thriving market for the capture and ransom of Jews, certainly not scholars and community leaders. It's believed that finally, years after he died in captivity, his body was ransomed for a token amount. In modern times, this has unfortunately been a significant issue in navigating the experience of the modern state of Israel. Many of us remember when an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, endured 5 years of captivity, which only came to an end with a massive exchange. More than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, collectively responsible for over 500 murders, were released to bring Gilad home. Even many people who might think of themselves as progressives or peaceniks thought this was perhaps a little too much. But the scale of the situation, how far we're willing to go, the thin line we walk when we compromise how people view the prospect of kidnapping a Jew, is reflective of something that I think is deeply Jewish and also deeply human. During the 2008 conflict with Hezbollah, we saw live criminals exchange for even partial remains of Israeli soldiers' bodies. And soon after the war with Hamas began on October 7th, 2023, Ma'ariv took a survey in Israel showing that more than half of Israelis believed they would support a ceasefire with Hamas, as aware of the political implications as we all are, if all hostages were returned. 4% were even willing to support a ceasefire in exchange for information about the hostages, information that we know might have come to them outdated or entirely untrue. Ahead of Thanksgiving, the Israeli government agreed to an exchange rate of at least 3 Palestinian prisoners for each Israeli captive. In these conflicts, the worry about our loved ones' captivity is less about any fear of the dissolution of the Jewish people, but a need we have in our core to care for our loved ones even in their burial, even once they are deceased, and in our hearts and minds, even if we are unable to connect with them directly. We think of care packages sent to kids who are away at summer camp or college, or like Mordechai sent to Esther during her captivity. To not have anywhere to send the love we have for another, but into the ether, into our prayers, is a type of pain no one should have to experience. And yet, this is part of reality still, for our people and for others. We should be cautious and self-reflective with invocations of the great mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuyim. Those of us who live in countries that are relatively free, where we have good opportunities to participate in society with fair relationships with other peoples, should stop and think before assuming that a Jewish American in a government prison, found guilty of a crime that we certainly view as a crime perpetuated by others. Jonathan Pollard, certainly Shalom Rubashkin, being 2 recent examples, are halachically captives. One can argue that perhaps a sentence was too heavy, and many of us rightly believe that the criminal justice system needs real refinement. But it is moral malpractice to compare conscientious criminals to children snatched from schoolyards, revelers carried away from music festivals, families sitting down for Shabbat, kidnapped from their border area kibbutz. That said, the number of captives at any given moment is both unfathomable and not fully knowable. Estimates for humans being trafficked range just under 25 million globally to over 27 million. That's roughly the population of Australia, or the combined population of any number of small countries put together. Tens of millions of children, women, and men taken from their homes, their lives, and put into circumstances ranging from sexual slavery to coerced labor. The problem is focused on the most vulnerable populations, the poor, minorities of various sorts, people already threatened by armed conflict or climate change. What can we do? How can we help? Is it even possible? The United Nations has found that the majority of people who escape from captivity rely primarily on their own initiative, with fewer than a third being rescued by law enforcement and under 10% being saved by nonprofits. While this might seem like cause for despair, more than a fifth of trafficked people find freedom because of actions taken by friends, family, community members, and strangers. Regular people who care about them in particular, who care about others in general, and who refuse to sit idly by when such circumstances seem to be unfolding. While freeing a captive is often a delicate or even dangerous affair, we can all contribute to the reclamation of freedom for all by becoming aware of vulnerabilities in our own environments and raising awareness. If you're into climate justice, learn about how natural disasters interact with the trafficking landscape. If you're working towards Indigenous rights, elevate the voices of activists working on the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis. While raising awareness often seems like the most tepid, low-bar effort, we know that this is a situation in which it matters a great deal. Natan Sharansky, a refusenik, kept for nearly 9 years in a Soviet labor camp, and the first Jew released when Gorbachev came to power, said in no uncertain terms that Soviet Jewry would not have been redeemed if not for the pressure put on the USSR by the Jewish community around the world and leaders in different countries. This success comes in striking contrast to the 276 Nigerian girls famously stolen from their schoolrooms by members of the terrorist organization Boko Haram. While the story initially gripped the hearts of the world, global news outlets stopped crying out. More than a third of the girls originally kidnapped remain in captivity 9 years later. Those who were able to return home often escaped on their own, sometimes with a baby in tow. We'll conclude with an excerpt from the traditional prayer for the freeing of captives, which has served Jews for over 1,000 years. May we merit to see in our lifetimes a day when all whose freedom has been stolen from them find it returned in full. And the prayer, on account of our prayers, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu shower compassion over them and deliver them from darkness and strife, remove their bondage, deliver them from their afflictions, and return them speedily to the embrace of their families. Shabbat Shalom.